Yeah, so when do we go live? Right now.
Yes. Whenever you're ready.
It's happening. Okay, this is.
Hi everyone, my name's Serena. I'm from the Edinburgh Marketing Network, and it's a pleasure to be here to talk tonight from Andrew and Neil. We're here for the book launch of Badvertising, Polluting Our Minds and Feeling Time Chaos. It's a great book. It sets out negative effects of advertising and consumption on ourselves and also on our societies. It also sets out the achievements in banning harmful ads in the past, and sets out the beginning of a vision of what a world without advertising might look like. Andrew and Leo are here to speak to us at an important point in advertising policy in Edinburgh, in our city. Next month, the City Edinburgh Council will be voting on a new advertising policy, which aims to, and I'm just going to read my words here properly, strengthen sustainability and low carbon considerations. That sounds great, but we've not seen the words of it, we've not seen it. And our group have been pushing Edinburgh Council to ban high carbon ads for a while now, and because we're concerned about the impact that advertising has on the planet, but also on our children, which we picked up in the book. So I'm going to hand over to Andrew and Neil in a moment. As you listen, I would like to ask you to think about two things. First of all, some great questions for the Q&A, but secondly, about the advertising we have in the city. What you see, how it makes you feel, and if you want to do something about it, if you'd like to see that change. If you do, that's great. Tell your friends, tell your family, and most importantly, tell your kids and we can put some action together. So, without further ado, I'll hand over to Neil.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
Thanks very much, and thanks for coming on such a cold and chilly night, and at a time which was accidental, but the timing for this evening is good, as the world has been meeting this week out in the United Arab Emirates to talk about how we're going to reverse climate change, or so you might think, until you read some of the small print, and it is quite extraordinary the degree to which these processes can be hijacked. So, when it emerged that the UAE themselves were going to be using the climate conference to strike more oil and gas deals around the world. And it's in the same context as some of the other big players, like the Saudis, have happily admitted that they've been throwing a lot of money around. And there's a chapter in the book, and we'll come to this a little bit later, which the Saudis have been throwing advertising and sponsorship money at sport, at big global sport, the stuff that gets some of the biggest audiences in the world. And they've admitted that they're doing it for reasons of sports wash. And they don't care if it gives a little boost to the Saudi economy. It also emerged that the Saudis have got a program going at the moment, which was a little bit more hush-hush, called, and I quote, the Oil Sustainability Program. Now, that's got nothing to do with making our use of fossil fuels more sustainable. It's how to sustain oil use. They've actually been trying to hook African and Asian countries on long-term fossil fuel dependency. So it's a bit of a weird world that we're living in at the moment. Now, there's no prizes at all for guessing what the book is about. It kind of gives it away on the front cover. And to cut to the chase about what our ultimate aim is, we're seeking a tobacco-style ban on advertising and sponsorship that fuels climate breakdown. And our clear and simple message is that when you're in a hole, it's a really good idea to stop digging, because we've had the entire consensus of the scientific community telling us that we need a rapid, immediate, and comprehensive withdrawal from the use of fossil fuels. And at the moment, most of the indicators are heading in the wrong direction. But at the very same time that the scientists are saying that in one ear, shouting in the other ear is an entire culture that's promoting that we should go on as we are. Take those long-haul flights, buy those giant SUVs, keep leading those high carbon lifestyles like there's no tomorrow. And you won't be surprised that that is a line and a half joke that possibly occurs more than once in the book. And there's lots of other reasons, and the book does go into those about why advertising is bad for us, it's bad for our well-being, how it undermines our ability to achieve well-being. And once you start scratching the surface of this, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well, there is some really scary stuff that is already known and has been known for some time about how advertising works. And just to kind of quote from one scientific paper that looked at brain imaging, neurological imaging, when people are exposed to familiar brands and adverts. And this was published in the Business Strategy Review, which is a journal, 20 years ago. And the authors said, scary as it may sound, if an ad does not modify the brains of the intended audience, then it has not worked. And I think Leo might have something to ask you or us to see to what degree that might be the case.
So, who here would like to sing us a jingle from your childhood that you can remember? Andrew, you can go first.
And if you're feeling a bit shy, I'll show that it's possible to be completely shameless here. The one that sticks in my mind is, and this is a generational one, not everyone will get this. Does anybody here remember the Smash advert? When MASH gets smashed. This was an advert for dehydrated potato powder, marketed in the 1970s. And they had these little sort of like robots that were made of like basically plastic kitchen utensils. And the joke was they were laughing at humans who would even dream of preparing and cutting up and cooking a real vegetable. Why would you do that when, you know, you can make dehydrated mashed potato from ultra processed food?
So, you know, I'm from the 80s. I'm a little bit younger than Andrew.
Not much.
Finger of fudge is just enough to give the kids a treat, right? Now, that is like indelibly etched in my brain. So, anyone want to sing us a jingle from your childhood?
There are prizes for
I
people
know
who are prepared to do this.
The depths of your brain right now. Well, thinking of the jingles.
We have merchandise that you may get in return for singing as a
Jingles
jingle.
and prizes. No? Come on.
Batman, give that man a badge. That man needs a badge.
And so it really is, you know, it's just illustrative of these tactics have been being used in us our whole lives. And they're not things that we spend time consciously thinking about on a day-to-day basis. They're in there, deep inside.
Yeah. And just to sort of say a little bit about some of the techniques that get used, there's things like sort of, you know, priming and surveillance advertising. And interestingly, actually, given that we're in Edinburgh this evening, that some of the earliest people to realise the power of advertising to not just pass on information about that a seller might be wanting to give about themselves, but and I quote here from the history of advertising that in the mid-18th century, Scottish newspaper copywriters were some of the first to realise that advertising was more about exciting the imagination of the buyer and the value of owning a product, and it was about creating trust between the manufacturer, the product, and the consumer. Jump forward a couple of centuries to the early 20th century, and the actual history of some of these early techniques that were employed by advertising have got a very murky past. The very earliest people who thought of themselves as sort of professional advertisers termed themselves as consumption engineers. They were engineering you to consume. And perhaps the most famous practitioner is a guy called Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. He was employed in the US government's First World War information department. It was actually their propaganda department. And he was in charge of military propaganda and psychological warfare. And he realized that the techniques that they were using to try and control public opinion, try and mobilize people during wartime, could be used equally to control public opinion and behavior as well in peacetime. And so Bernays became the sort of grandfather of modern public relations and advertising and marketing. But he realized that you couldn't call it what you called it then, because people might think it's a bit dodgy. You couldn't call it propaganda. So he literally came up with the term public relations to rebrand what started out as military propaganda. And just to kind of give a little flavor, there's lots of kind of examples in the book about the degree to which this stuff can get under your skin. There's an experiment that was done by a youth group called Fight Back 2030 a couple of years ago. And you can look this up on YouTube. It's fascinating to watch. What they did was get a group of young people and they invited them to kind of an upmarket fast food restaurant. But unbeknownst to the young people, for the 24 hours before they went there, they targeted them on their social media. They targeted them with visual advertising. They targeted them down to the degree that when they sent cabs to take them to this fast food restaurant, they had made special recordings that sounded like normal commercial radio that was played in the cab to them, the sort of thing which happens all the time anyway, that subtly primed them to buy a particular dish. And that dish was triple dipped chicken. When they got to the restaurant, there was a menu with about 50 options. Every single person that had been targeted ordered triple dipped chicken. Now, when you think that every day, every week, you're bombarded with hundreds and thousands of advertising, and increasingly in sophisticated ways on your more sort of tailored social media feeds, that stuff is being worked on you all the time. And of course, it has really profound effects on our well-being. So we know now that children as young as 2 who are exposed to advertising become brand aware. From the ages of 3, children, kind of peer pressure starts to kick in around the kind of brands that you have, whether it's your clothes or the stuff that you're eating. So young children start to judge each other on their social worth from as young as 3, according to the kind of stuff that they're wearing, because they've been exposed to advertising. We know that preschool children recognize more unhealthy than healthy food brands, and that recognition of unhealthy choices shoots up between the ages of 3 and 4. And in some of the research which has been done in the US, they estimate that exposure to TV advertising is perhaps the single largest factor in the epidemic of obesity among children in the USA. So, and one of the tools in the advertiser's toolkit is a kind of priming. There's another example, another interesting little academic test, exercise, experiment. This was done with college-age US students. They were invited just to have a nice afternoon playing a video game. It was a driving game, racing game. And they didn't know what they were being tested for. So in some of the versions of the game, the cars that people were driving had a variety of adverts on them or none at all. In one of the games, the cars had the branding for the caffeine and sugar drink Red Bull. Now, I don't know if you've kind of seen Red Bull, but what they do is they quite often sponsor extreme sports events. They studied how the college students played the game. And the students who played the game with the Red Bull cars, 2 things they noticed. They drove much faster and they drove much more recklessly. And as a consequence of that, they either, if they got lucky, they scored well, but just as often they crashed and died in the game. And they were completely unaware that their behavior was being influenced by this priming, by this particular brand. And from one of the academics who's done sort of research into real life behavior, it's been shown that image conscious people who drive very high social status cars also exhibit some of the most antisocial behaviour on the roads. They're least likely to stop at a zebra crossing, for example. So this kind of stuff has been going on all the time. And even if, like Leo and I, we kind of think about this stuff and we try to be sort of aware of it, it gets under our skin, doesn't it, Leo? And I think you had an experience like that.
So one of the most insidious things about this is that it's not recognized. In many ways, it's designed to not be recognizable as a problem, because the whole purpose of the industry is to manipulate your behavior below the level of your conscious reasoning. Right? So they're not trying to talk you into hearing all the reasons why you should buy this brand. They're just trying to manipulate you by pulling the levers that exist, around the back. So most of the influence is taking place below that surface level of consciousness. And I had this experience where I've been freaking out about climate change for a good 20 years, and I've been on 2 flights in that time. One was for my honeymoon, and we took our kids to Costa Rica for the summer. And hadn't been out of the country for a long time. And the kids were quite small, they were like 3 and 5. And so I was quite anxious coming out of San Jose Airport. We were in a taxi drive from an unfamiliar city. And so I was in this sort of state of anxiety, and we passed a BMW showroom. And as I saw the BMW logo outside the showroom, a wave of sort of familiarity, comfort, a sensation of safety washed over me. And in that moment, I was like, I took a sort of a sigh of relief. And then in the next moment, I was like, what just happened to me? Because I have never owned a BMW. As far as I know, I've never driven a BMW. It's quite possible I've never been in a BMW, to my knowledge, right? And at a conscious level, I have absolutely no positive association. I don't have any good feelings or thoughts about BMW, the car manufacturers. And yet, somehow, they wired me in this way that when I encounter the brand at a subconscious level, I have an emotional response to it. Now, that is happening. So if you put that stuff together with, the Red Bull experiment, right? No one had consumed any Red Bull in that sort. But their behavior was changed just by the bit of the branding being on the car that they drive. Now, this is something which this is something which we have been experiencing this throughout our lives, and the fact that we can all remember these jingles from when we were small shows you how effective those techniques were. But they're quite crude, and the age that we're living in now, we all subscribe to these services that are free services, but of course they're not really free because we are the product. What's happening is the data that we generate through our interactions with the internet, social media, is then immediately feeding a system that is selling that data on to people so that they can target us to sell us. And the other day I watched a Netflix documentary with my son, Inside the Mind of a Cat. It's quite good. We like cats. I put him to bed, fired up Twitter, and literally the ads on my timeline were ads for cat toys, which I've never been advertised cat toys to me before, right? And this is happening absolutely all the time. So, currently we both get targeted a lot with adverts for private jets and SUVs because the algorithms, the robots know that we talk about those things and we think about this. We're interested in those subjects. They're not smart enough yet to realize that we're like the anti-consumers for those things. But it's only a matter of time. The machine learning is like we're constantly feeding this stuff, and it's only going to get more sophisticated. So they've been very effective at manipulating our behavior to date. But we're now entering an era where this stuff is going to get away from us. So
and what drives us? What we're most concerned about? I mean, we talked specifically about climate change, but of course it's about overall overconsumption as well, and our impact on the biosphere and the overstressing of our ecological systems. And it feels kind of crazy being in this moment because we've known about the impossibility of increased aggregate economic growth at a global level for a long time. In fact, one of the first things that Leo and I did together was I used to work for an organization called the New Economics Foundation, and we did a very kind of number crunchy report about the impossibility of infinite economic growth, and it's stuff that needs to kind of keep restating. And we were looking for a way of kind of graphically representing this. And one of the things we stumbled across in casual conversation, a little known fact, but hamsters, from when they're born, for the first 6 or 7 weeks of their life, double in weight each week. We just kind of asked the question, what would happen if that didn't stop? We ran the numbers, and we worked out that on that hamster's first birthday, you would be looking at a 9 billion ton hamster that would eat the entire world's production of maize for a year and kind of still be hungry. So maybe a little animation about that to kind of make this point.
The impossible hamster.
The impossible hamster. You can find that one.
You can find
it. But the way we can see this in a very kind of practical sense day to day is another thing. Working with the New Economics Foundation, we came up with a measure which we called Ecological Debt Day, or Earth Overshoot Day, where we measure the day in the year when human consumption and production of waste overwhelms the biosphere's ability to regenerate and absorb that waste. And it was the early 70s was the last time when the world as a whole, the human population as a whole, was living within our environmental means. Ever since then, the day has been crawling earlier in the year. And as it goes earlier in the year, that's a measure of how quickly we've got through the amount that we could sort of, in quotes, afford to consume. As of last year, the date had crept forward to July the 28th, which means that for all the time after that, we're eroding the biosphere's capacity, faster than it can replace. We're sort of, putting the rug from under our own feet. And to illustrate the degree to which advertising can push us in the wrong direction in a climate sense, we also did some numbers looking at the way that sports utility vehicles, SUVs, which on average are much more highly polluting than ordinary cars and have been sort of pointed out as being one of the prime causes of increasing emissions, when emissions might have been falling in some sectors. The shift to driving SUVs has been one of the big push factors. Now, it wasn't little more than a decade ago, SUVs were about 1 in 10 of every new car bought. Within a decade, they've become more than half of all new cars bought. That shift was driven by car makers through advertising. And Leo will say a little bit more about that later. So we know the way in which advertising is not just making us consume more, but even negatively switching our behavior to more polluting choices than some of the other ones which are available. We looked at the impact for a year of the additional number of cars bought and flights taken as a result of advertising. And we can work out a kind of a rough range in this, because advertising within itself, it doesn't kind of publish these figures publicly very often, but they've got a rough idea of how much their advertising would increase sales. So we looked at cars and flights together globally, and for a single year, the additional stuff that got bought, flights taken, that wouldn't have happened otherwise, was roughly equivalent to the emissions of the whole of the Netherlands, or up to as much as twice those of Spain in a given year. So that's just from the additional marketing. And to flip it, we know that the reverse is also true. A study was done in London when Transport for London introduced a ban on junk food advertising. And after that had several months to sort of settle in, they looked at how people's eating habits, consumption habits have changed. And what the study showed was that for an average household in London, the calories consumed have gone down by about 1,000 per week. So that we know if you take away those constant prompts to consume, that things can change. I think you're going to tell us a little bit about another historical precedent that tells us about the power of actually removing that kind of encouragement from our immediate environment.
So the obvious example here is tobacco. And when I say it's obvious, it's genuinely freakish, the parallels between what happened with the tobacco industry and how we wound up with a ban on ads for it, and where we are today with the fossil fuel industry. But in both cases, you're talking about a product that is damaging. It's damaging for the people who are buying it, it's damaging for people around them, And the companies that's selling it, they knew, they found this out long before this information was made public. And rather than do anything about it, they covered it up and spent lots of money on pretending that the opposite was true. So literally trying to mislead, so hiding the findings and then spending on misleading the public into continuing to consume the product. And you know, in the case of the tobacco industry, they literally they set up a fellowship for doctors. So they paid doctors to smoke in front of patients in order to reassure them that they could continue smoking as well and that was okay. But the parallels are, it's absolutely uncanny. But in both cases, there's been a conspiracy of misinformation, disinformation by these industries that has now been proven in court. It took a very long time to prove it for tobacco. It was a bit quicker to prove for the fossil fuel industries. But even divestment, you know, divestment is a big it's a big dimension of the climate struggle today, trying to get money out of investing in fossil fuels. And the BMA, the British Medical Association, had one of the first sort of official bodies to agree that actually we need to start to discourage people from smoking. And then it was pointed out that to their pension money was invested in tobacco companies. And initially they were super offended about this, and they were no, these things are completely unconnected. And it's very like the Church of England today, who still have money in fossil fuels actually, and they've been finding it very, very difficult to get the money out of it. But you know, healthy cigarettes, so basically the hybrid vehicles of the cigarette world, citrals, menthol lights. That's right. They were allowed briefly. They were allowed to market them as healthy, even though they didn't have any evidence for that. And extraordinary corruption from politicians in both cases. So I'm going to leave you to read the chapter, but you know, Kenneth Clarke. Ken Clarke, those of you remember him, he was Tory Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was also the chairman of British American Tobacco. And as soon as he became Chancellor, he defunded all of the public health spending on trying to persuade the public to stop smoking. But it's not just him, because you may also remember Tony Blair. New Labour promised to implement a full tobacco ad ban when they came in. It had been banned for television since the 1960s, but successive governments had said they were going to do something about it and then never quite gotten around to it. New Labour promised to do it when they got in, and then it didn't happen. A bunch of time passed, and then it transpired he'd taken a load of money from Bernie Ecclestone. If anybody remembers that, they had £1 million from Formula One. In order to, and Formula One then got an exemption. So tobacco was allowed to continue sponsoring Formula One, literally because he bought off Tony Blair. So I think there's an important lesson from all of this for campaigners today, which is that the original ad ban for cigarettes on TV, which didn't include cigar smoking, so I can still remember in the 80s, you know, Hamlet, yeah, that's right. But there was a landmark report out in 1962, which conclusively drew the links between smoking, cancer, and death. And 3 years later, a new government, it was a Labour government, got in and they implemented a ban on TV ads for smoking. And then they were supposed to follow through and implement a full ban, but the industry got into gear. And, you know, vested interests just moved in. They bought off politicians. They had ministers moved out of post. And this just happened again and again. It took 40 years then for the full tobacco ad ban to come in. And the lesson, I think, for campaigns today is you just have to move very quickly. And of course, you know, we are now on the cusp of a new government in Westminster. I don't imagine people in this room have particularly high hopes for that government. But, it will be a new government, and maybe we can get to do stuff quickly. It's very unlikely that we'll be able to get them to do stuff slowly, essentially, because that is the vested interest just move in. So that's tobacco, but I also want to talk about the two things that are the strongest parallels for it today, and that is flights and cars, and specifically SUVs. And the reason why they're so relevant. So when it comes to cars cars are the ultimate positional good. So they're very, very important in relation to this, like the advertising problematic. So what is a positional good? A positional good is something which you don't buy for its practical utility. It's not meeting a practical need in your life. You're buying it in order to display your social status to other people, to signal where you are in society in relation to other people. And it's the most expensive thing most people will ever buy after the home that they live in. Most people will never see your home, but they will see your car and they will see you driving around them. And so it's the ultimate position of good, but it's also got an incredible power in our psyches, right? So cars have always been sold as freedom. That's basically when you buy a car, you're buying freedom. And that started in the US, but they've managed to kind of infect all of us with this car brain. That's how we relate to it. But they very quickly ran into a problem because they sold cars as freedom, cars as escape, cars as adventure. And this is something we talk about the open road paradox, because we've all seen car ads, many car ads. There's never any other cars in those car ads. There's only ever the car they're trying to sell you on a glorious open road, unimpeded.
Through the
right?
Highland.
Exactly. But in reality, the reality of driving for most people is that you spend most of your time stuck at traffic jams. And that happened actually very quickly in the 1920s. By the late 1920s, Ford had sold enough cars in the US that people had started to get really annoyed that there was just cars everywhere because there wasn't enough road for it. And literally, US market has managed, they came up with this brilliant, they were like, oh, we've got a problem here. Our market's going to stop being able to grow. They were like, no, it's not a problem, there's too many cars. There's not enough road. And it literally was dreamed up by US automobile manufacturers. And they were so successful at this that they persuaded successive governments all around the world to put endless amounts of public money into building more and more and more road in order to accommodate the more cars that these guys wanted to sell us. But how does this relate to SUVs? SUVs are off-roaders. They offer this transcendental freedom where you're no longer tied to the road. And so one of the key themes in how they're sold to us is wilderness and nature, very paradoxically. So most SUV ads, the imagery that's, I've looked at untold numbers of these things. The imagery is they're always like in a forest or on a beach or on a mountain. So they're somewhere in nature.
Rather than the reality.
Which is
Chelsea.
Literally Chelsea. So people think Chelsea tractors, so we did a piece of analysis looking at where large SUVs are most popular. So where are they being registered? And lo and behold, Kensington and Chelsea is the place where large SUVs are most popular. Now I live in London, and I can say there are no off-roading opportunities in Kensington and Chelsea. But of course, it goes back to the positional good thing. So yes, I better hurry up. So it's one of the most amazing things. So partly they did it with literally camping kits when they first started selling these things. They kitted out showrooms, Ford kitted out showrooms with streams and rocks and camping equipment. They put up some tents and things like that. But one of the most astonishing things to me in learning about this has been that obviously they have their history as military vehicles. So they started out in the Second World War as Jeeps, and then Jeeps inspired. We had Land Rovers in this country. Then the Land Rover became the Range Rover, which was originally a very utilitarian vehicle. It had a hose-down dashboard and things, but it was still being to land that it was marketed to posh buyers. Their first psychological profile that automotive manufacturers commissioned for who might buy these vehicles is unbelievably unflattering about the people that they were targeting. So that the Dodge Ram is one of the early ones, and Dodge commissioned this work, and most people hated the ads that Dodge Ram were producing, but the small minority of people who liked them really loved them, really got them going. And these are basically insecure, antisocial, anti-communitarian, highly individualistic middle-aged men. And that was literally it's like a psychotic, psychotic sort of psychological profile for that group. But unfortunately, it's been so successful that it's kind of triggered an arms race. So it's no longer the case that it's only that group that buys these things. And the other key group is actually they do a lot of marketing these things to women. And the pitch to women is slightly different. It's often mischaracterized as safety. People are selling SUVs on safety grounds. But that is actually fundamentally misunderstanding. When you look at the imagery and the language that is used in the adverts, it's not about safety. It is about danger and violence. And what they do, these ads, is they show the world as a dangerous place that you need to protect yourself from. And look, we've got the solution, which is this sort of armored vehicle that you could drive around in. So I need to talk about flights a bit. And it's if cars are the ultimate position of good, flights are the ultimate aspirational service. And this, again, it taps into some very deep strains of human psyche. Every human culture, for as long as we have records, has had mythology around flight. So there's been supernatural figures, gods, demigods who are able to fly. And the UN body that is the sort of governance body for aviation globally, ICAO, actually adopted, so they had a mural commission for their headquarters of Icarus. Now, those of you who know the myth of Icarus, the mural depicts Icarus in the glory phase of his mythic arc, right? But of course, what happened was he flew too close to the sun and plummeted to his death. And so it's unintentionally incredibly opposite for the situation that we have today. Because when it comes to air travel, it's the clearest example of something for which there is no environmentally friendly alternative. So just don't be fooled. There's nothing coming down the line, not on any meaningful time frame for solving the climate crisis, right? There are things people are working on. Eventually we might get there. We don't have time to wait for that. The only thing that actually works is to do less of this stuff. And that is extremely difficult to do if you are part of a social strata that has become accustomed to these things, right? Now, this goes to our central ask in the book with the campaign, is to just stop advertising this stuff to people, because advertising represents precisely the portion of our consumption that is excess, that is surplus to requirements. It's the things that we wouldn't have done if we didn't see the advert. So yes, people might have family overseas and you need to see your family, right? You're going to take that flight anyway. You don't need to have a flight advertised to you to take a flight that you needed to take. The only purpose of a flight ad is to get you to do a flight that you weren't going to do otherwise. And so, that Andrew mentioned the stats for, we did this analysis. Just the flight emissions alone is the size of Wales, right? So ads for flights are causing emissions that are equivalent to the annual emissions of Wales. And so stopping ads for flights would very rapidly cut emissions for something for which there is no alternative. So just to summarize that point, there are certain things which there is a very powerful expert consensus that aggregate consumption of those things has to fall if we are going to meet our climate change goals. Air travel is one of them. Red meat is another. Right? So there's a handful of things for which there just isn't, there's nothing else is coming, right? We just have to do less of those things. Collectively, we have to do substantially less of them. And yet, we're in a situation where there's nothing to stop these corporations from constantly telling us to do more of these things. So, to my mind, the flight swing is actually the clearest case for what we're calling for here.
And one of the areas where you see this stuff played out, and it's backs up that historical analogy of how we finally got around to banning a lot of tobacco advertising, is in the world of sport. Tobacco companies used to love sport. I used to like cricket when I was a kid, and I used to go and watch my county play. And I used to go and watch the Benton and Hedges League. There I was, an 11-year-old boy being, advertised to by a cigarette company, and it was kind of normalised. And all the arguments back then about, sport wouldn't survive if you took tobacco sponsorship away. Obviously turned out to be false because the ban came in and sport continued. But sport today, in terms of high carbon advertising, whether it's actual fossil fuel companies who are sponsoring things for slightly different reasons, like Gazprom didn't sponsor UEFA to get you to go and buy directly, Gazprom oil and gas. They did it for political license, for social license, to make themselves look good in public. And FIFA now, which is in cahoots with Aramco, the biggest producer of oil on a daily basis worldwide. So you have those. But also, and I invite you to, even if you're not really kind of into sports, hard to avoid it. The next time you see something on TV, look at the court side, the pitch side advertisers. It's airlines, it's car makers, and quite often it is fossil fuel companies as well. Sport is kind of floating on a sea of high carbon sponsorship at the moment. And we think that that's one of the areas where we can see some change kicking in. And there's a lot of battles going on already. Like, saw a couple of years ago when we were getting this campaign going, I was watching a bit of the Australian Tennis Open, and the courtside sponsors there were literally, it was a fossil fuel company, it was an airline, and it was a car maker. Now, the Australian Open, as a consequence of campaigning, has dropped the fossil fuel company. It's still got the airline and the car maker, but there was a little bit of a kind of a chink in the armor. And we know that at some level or other, sport feels under pressure to show that it's doing the right thing climate-wise. Sometimes they do it in really peculiar ways, like, for example, Manchester City, which is airline-sponsored, Middle Eastern fossil fuel wealth sponsored, but it wanted to get its supporters, they wanted to kind of make its supporters feel that they were part of a club that was a bit responsible. And do you know what they did? They invited them to recycle their plastic cups, for which they would be rewarded with air miles. There are issues here. Just last year, earlier this year, there was British Cycling took an 8-year sponsorship deal from Shell. So there you had a sport or an activity which should be the poster child for more sustainable ways of doing things, being sponsored by Shell. Shell has been also putting a lot of money into sport in other areas. There was such a kind of a pushback from that. So many members left British Cycling as a consequence because they were outraged by it, that the CEO was forced to resign. So we know that there is some sort of possibility going forward, but also from sport's own point of view, by taking this kind of money, they are literally shooting themselves in the foot, or nailing the lid on their own coffin. And one of the clearest examples we saw, we did a piece of research earlier this year with some Scandinavian colleagues of ours. We looked at the sponsors of the world's biggest outdoor ski race. It's kind of like the London Marathon of the ski world. It's called the Lidingö Galoppet, and they're sponsored by a fossil fuel company called Preem, a car maker, Volvo. And we did some calculations, and we worked out that the emissions from those two sponsors alone would be enough to melt an area of snow 230 times the size of this ski race. And this ski race is like 90 kilometers long through the Swedish. So there are crazy things going on. And also, Aramco sponsored the recent International World Cricket Cup. So that you saw in the final, India against Australia, two countries that have been literally going up in flames in some instances, and yet taking sponsorship from the very activity, the very kind of companies who are making the problem worse. So what do we do about it? What do we do about it? Well, one of the conclusions that we came to is one of the conclusions that people are coming to in all sorts of interesting places, actually. There used to be a department within Whitehall in government in Westminster called the Behavioural Insights Team.
The Nudge Unit.
Known as the Nudge Unit. The Nudge Unit published a report to coincide, or just before the Glasgow COP, actually, climate conference, in which they came to the conclusion that nudging was no longer enough. This report was published. It then emerged that none of the people at ministerial level or in government actually realised it was coming. So it was very rapidly unpublished. It was removed. And the Behavioural Insights team,
but we'd all downloaded it already.
We'd all downloaded it already, yes, exactly. The Behavioural Insights team were then moved out of government and hived off out to the backwater of some sort of research body. But we know, people who are expert in this area, they know that nudging isn't enough, which is why we want to see a ban on high carbon advertising. Now, what's wrong with the kind of regulation of advertising we have at the moment, the Advertising Standards Authority? Well, basically, you can say that when it does anything, it happens too late. It's like shutting the barn door after the horse has bolted. It's usually months after the advertising campaign has actually been run. The number of actual actions they take compared to the complaints they get, I can tell you they get a lot of really well-informed complaints, are too few. About 2% of environmental complaint claims actually lead to formal implementation action. It's very unclear. It's really blurry because there's lots of different departments that work on this issue in different ways. And there's a number of platforms which the ASA doesn't have jurisdiction over. And it's really unclear about when they do and when they don't. And if you want to make a complaint and you want to understand all of this, you've got to be pretty expert. You've got to have the time and the resources to be actually be able to use the system. So their scope is really kind of quite limited. They've got this very narrow remit. So we think we need more effective rules, and we need a more empowered and independent regulator. We want those tobacco-style controls on high carbon advertising, and we want to close those loopholes which allow a lot of the polluting advertising, the kind of the false claims that get through. We want it to be much more proactive. At the moment, even though they say that now that they're using some form of artificial intelligence to pre-screen to screen many adverts, we haven't seen any evidence that that's leading through to any more actions being taken or any more effective controls being introduced. But I want to finish just this bit of the chat so we can then have a bit of time for some questions. Just on a positive note, and the positive note is that in spite of the way that the dice are loaded so much against us, and that it's really hard just walking around to not be influenced by this kind of cultural paint pot of overconsumption that advertising pushes, is the fact that in spite of that, things are happening around the world. There are councils around the country and in England, some sort of quite major cities that have introduced these policies. It's starting to happen internationally, everywhere from Chennai to Amsterdam to Sao Paulo in Brazil, even some states in the US that are introducing, that have these kind of controls. In England, Cambridge County Council, Norwich, Liverpool, weirdly Basingstoke. I don't know why I say weirdly Basingstoke, but Basingstoke always has to have an adjective in front of it of some kind. Coventry, they are bringing in policies, and it's been shown that it's possible to do that. And once you get a group of councillors that can see how it can happen, it can inspire other forms of action as well.
And just to remember, Edinburgh, it's on the cards.
It's on the cards here too. In the meantime, we obviously think that that rather than just kind of letting advertisers run riot, we think that the government should have an active and responsible public information campaign that's actually telling people about the consequences of different forms of consumption, of different kinds of lifestyles. Because we firmly believe also that the kind of changes that you might make in your life to go lower carbon can really improve your well-being as well as our long-term chances of survival. Now, there is no department in Westminster that's doing that at the moment. So we actually invented one, the Ministry for the Climate Emergency. You can look it up on badverts.org, and you can see some wonderful animations which Leo has made.
Brain pollution. That's the if you know Chris Van Tulliken, anyone who's got kids in here, Chris and Sam's Operation Ouch. He is a BBC TV doctor and the author of a book about junk food, and he has kindly voiced those animations for us. So brain pollution, planes on the brain, and we've got a new one coming out in the new year about SUVs.
Yeah, that's you heard it here first. So we've got a little bit of time for questions, but we thought just to kind of kick questions off, as you're already neatly sitting in twos, just out of interest, and even speaking through your face masks, we'd like you to turn to the person next to you and ask that person and find out from that person what's the worst advert
So something that's really jarred with you.
So that really annoyed you.
So I frequently will read something on the Guardian website, and then in the middle of the story, there's an advert for an SUV, and I find it very. So yes,
and then if you call them up, you will get merch. The merch which includes this. Now, I need to explain what this is. This might look like ordinary hazard tape, It carries messages. This one says, warning, adverts heat the planet. And you can use it to wrap up your Christmas presents, but it has a special property. It has a special property, which means if you wet the back, it will stick to something. Now, I'm not saying that you should stick it to advertising billboards where you see adverts that you don't like, but that is one of the many, many different ways in which it could be used. But we also have badges and stickers, and we've got some postcards as well. So good suggestions get prizes. So if you'd like to turn to the person next, you just find out what's the most jarring advert.
2 minutes, 2 minutes.
Not more at all. No, yeah.
All right, brilliant. Great work, everyone. I'll give you 1 minute. Okay. So, who would like to tell us an example of a particularly egregious and upsetting advert that you've
I've got one here.
Brilliant, perfect, go.
So I've noticed a lot. The first one we were saying was the Kendall Jenner Pepsi ad, which was so terrible. But also I've noticed a lot of like the language of revolution is being used a lot in banking ads at the moment. And I saw this one on the tube. I took a photo of it, and it starts like this: in a world of endless possibilities, we find Sarah, a young dreamer yearning for adventure. Her heart longs to glide down the snowy slopes of grace, and it's fucking booking high expenses skiing ads. In a world of endless possibilities, we find a young dreamer. And I saw another one that was like saying no, opt out, and it was like literally the language of anti-capitalism. It was for signing up for like a MasterCard. And I remember it was fuck.
Imagine how they feel if it really was a revolution. That's a perfect example. What would you like to badge your hand and take?
Can I have two?
Yeah? Or a badge as well.
Good try. Anyone else? Yeah, go.
On where they turn the car and the people driving without the car, and so we all of them by the car. Now they all you go to on the stage without your car, and it's like, no, there's so much room.
I actually loved that ad because I think it was inadvertently, yeah. But people looked at it and they were like that, yeah, what? Brilliant. That definitely. Yeah. Any more for any more? All right. Well, look, if not, we should go to questions. And was that a hand up at the back there? Yeah, go on.
You know how all the big major companies come up with Christmas ad and it goes into commercial production. I find it so funny that people actually are enthusiastic to sit and watch them and be like, oh, which is the best one? And then I think and then I think Aldi now sell like the wee carrots now from their Christmas ads and stuff.
It is disturbing. I mean, one of the things, John Lewis is not a terrible corporate citizen in all sorts of different ways, compared to many others, right? But their ads, obviously, there's no product in their ads, so they're not. What they're trying to do is activate feelings in you that make you think about your family and think about your family and your home, and then maybe your furniture. And that's literally what that's the point of those ads. So yeah, but there's never they don't show you an armchair in it. It's much more clever than that.
your hesitate.
Take please.
Coming your way.
Not this structure.
Oh yes, one more hand go. Brilliant. Here's them. Oblivion Coal Mine is excellent. If you haven't seen it, look up Oblivion Coal Mine. Yes, but so we have some sort of allies. We have allies who are kind of following an insider strategy, right? So people like Clean Creatives and Purpose Disruptors are people who are working in the advertising industry and feel disquiet about its relationship with the climate crisis and are trying to do things about it. And one of the refrains that I hear a lot from them lately is that our problem is that the environmental movement is being outspent by the oil and gas industry by 38 to 1. Now, if you're in the ad industry, I think they include like environmentally friendly products and stuff like that anyway. So 38 to 1, right? And if you're in the ad industry, of course, that's like what we need to do is spend lots more money on advertising, environmental messaging, and that's where we're going wrong. But, I listen to that and I'm like, well, obviously, we will never be outspending the oil and gas industry on propaganda. That is a ludicrous idea and it's entirely implausible. So therefore, what needs to happen is, sure, we do need to use the power of marketing ourselves to promote these messages, but we also need to curb the ability of corporates that are selling us things that are torching the planet, right? And they can't quite manage to reach that conclusion.
Yeah, one of the things that we've seen in the research as well, and in our own research, is that if you have both those messages out in the public domain, the mainstream commercial one drowns out the sort of progressive messaging too.
Yeah.
So people just don't hear it as much. And would you like a badge or some hesitate?
That was an excellent question.
That was a really good one.
Any other questions?
If not, we're almost bang on. We're almost bang on the hour.
We're almost bang on. Go for it.
So it might be a bit long-winded. Basically, I don't know if you've heard of the Bailey Gifford controversy that happened in Edinburgh within the arts industry in the past couple of years.
I have not.
So
I have heard of it.
Bailey Gifford are they're some kind of finance company, and they pay for like the majority of the culture sector in Edinburgh. Like festivals were all sponsored by Bailey Gifford. And then it turned out that a lot of their investments were from oil. So the problem working in the arts is like the other example I can think of is Edinburgh Airport have a community fund that you can apply for if you are an arts organisation. So when you're an arts organisation trying to put on these big events and you have no money and everyone's underpaid already, the only companies that seem to have any money that they're willing to give you are the ones who are wrecking the planet. So do you know of any industries that aren't morally fucked that might pay for the culture sector? Basically,
the borders of moral fuckdom are blurry and not non-specific. The one thing I would say is we've got some really good colleagues back in England who called Culture Unstained, who've been working for a long time on getting fossil fuel money out of the arts. And what the evidence has shown is that when you do get those out, other money does come in, generally speaking. Now, of course, it's in a situation in which there's a much bigger conversation about, there should be more public funding of the arts.
Funded by corporates.
So
yes,
yeah. So if we're successful more broadly in achieving a low carbon and socially just transition, you will be seeing parts of the economy that are less morally fucked, emerging, who will engage in the same kind of activity. I mean, you can think of sponsors like, Triodos Bank, it's about as green as mainstream finance can get, and they do sponsor things. But it's a small pot at the moment, admittedly.
But look, I mean, I would say, and this is a good note of positivity to end on, right? The one area in the climate crisis that challenged the society where we're actually winning, we really are winning, is renewables. Right? Solar and wind have won. And they've won in very straightforward terms in the sense that they're now cheaper than fossil fuel alternatives. So they're just a superior technology in almost every regard. The reason why there's still money going into oil and gas is all about power and vested interests. It's not. It doesn't actually make sense within even the terms of the market itself. The market worked in a way that it pretends to. No one will be spending any more money on oil and gas. But what that means is that there are some pure play renewable energy companies that are out there that haven't made very much money yet, but they will quite soon be rolling in it. So there's companies like Ørsted, which used to be DONG. It was Danish Oil and Natural Gas, a slightly comical acronym in English, which I don't think they thought about in advance. But Danish, they've sold or they've got rid of it all. So they no longer have any fossil fuels in their books at all. They have very successfully slightly predated on the UK's offshore wind market. So they own about 50% of the offshore wind capacity in our waters. And they're half owned by the Danish government, which is a classic example of UK neoliberalism where it gets you. But basically, I would take Ørsted's money in a heartbeat, right? And there'll be more and more of that. So I would just say that is coming down the line.
And there should be proper funding of the arts.
Yes, thanks.
And thank you very much for coming and for contributing. I'll leave a few stickers, which can also be stuck on anything which catches your attention, and a few badges out the front as well. So help yourselves. And really nice of you to come out on such a cold night.
Yes, thank you so much for coming. Well, I'm going to take a selfie with you guys. Normally, I would say if anyone doesn't want to be in a photo, but you all wear masks, so I feel like I don't need your consent. You won't be identifiable.
Give it away.
Oh yeah, it's away.
Away.
Thank you.